California in the mid-1970s was a place of promise. The suburbs of Sacramento, Stockton, and surrounding communities were filled with young families moving into newly built homes. Neighbors greeted one another warmly, kids biked to school without fear, and it was not unusual to leave doors unlocked at night. The Golden State lived up to its name, at least on the surface. But behind the veneer of quiet suburbia, something dark was already taking shape. Burglaries were on the rise. Reports of prowlers circulated, but most residents dismissed them as isolated incidents. Law enforcement dealt with theft, car break-ins, and the usual crimes of growing suburban communities. What no one realized was that a predator was already watching, already testing boundaries, already planning something far worse. The earliest hints of the nightmare came in the form of break-ins in the Visalia area. Homes were entered while families slept. Drawers were rifled through, but little of value was taken. Sometimes nothing was stolen at all. Instead, items were moved from one place to another, photographs scattered across the floor, or strange arrangements left behind, as though the intruder wanted his victims to know he had been there. These weren't ordinary burglaries. They were rehearsals. The man responsible, later linked to the Golden State Killer, was learning how to move silently, how to evade dogs, how to bypass locks and alarms. More importantly, he was learning the feeling of control that came with violating the sanctity of a stranger's home. For the victims, the fear was chilling. They would wake up, discover their homes disturbed, and realize someone had walked among them as they slept. One woman later recalled, "It was like someone had been inside my mind as much as inside my house. He knew where I kept things. He knew me in ways he shouldn't. But these incidents were brushed aside by police as the work of a skilled burglar. No one imagined that a far more terrifying pattern was emerging." In 1976, the escalation began. What started as burglary transformed into sexual assault, and it happened in the heart of Sacramento's suburbs. A masked man broke into the homes of women, often single, sometimes with children sleeping in the next room. He carried a flashlight and a weapon. His method was chillingly precise. He tied up his victims with shoelaces or rope, often using their own household items. He blindfolded them and threatened them with death if they moved. If a man was present, he would bind him as well, forcing him to lie face down while stacking dishes or cups on his back. "If I hear the dishes move," he whispered, "I'll kill everyone in this house." Then he would drag the woman into another room, leaving the man to listen helplessly to what followed. The psychological cruelty was as devastating as the physical violence. Survivors described him as both robotic and emotional, switching from calm commands to sudden outbursts. Sometimes he whispered to himself. Sometimes he sobbed, as though reliving his own trauma. By the end of 1976, there were dozens of attacks. Sacramento residents no longer felt safe. Families who once left doors unlocked now nailed windows shut. Sales of guns, locks, and dogs skyrocketed. Neighborhood watch groups formed, and residents patrolled their streets with flashlights. But the attacks kept coming. One newspaper headline read, "East Area Rapist Strikes Again." The name stuck. The East Area Rapist was no longer a rumor whispered among neighbors. He was the shadow that haunted an entire region. The terror spread beyond Sacramento. By 1977, the East Area Rapist struck in Stockton, Modesto, and Contra Costa County. Police worked frantically but were always one step behind. He seemed to know their moves before they made them. Some survivors later recalled receiving harassing phone calls, sometimes months after their attack. One woman answered the phone late at night to hear nothing but heavy breathing. Another heard a whisper, "I'll kill you." The calls were traced but never successfully linked to a suspect. People lived with constant dread. One survivor described how she slept with a hammer under her pillow for years after her attack. Families abandoned their homes, too frightened to stay. In neighborhoods where attacks had occurred, property values plummeted. The very idea of safety had been shattered. Police tried to reassure the public, but behind the scenes, frustration grew. Detectives worked around the clock, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and chasing down tips. But the East Area Rapist was a phantom. He left no fingerprints, no clear description, and vanished into the night like a ghost. Despite the efforts, the attacks continued. More than 50 women were assaulted between 1976 and 1979. It was clear to investigators this was not a man who would stop on his own. He was escalating. He was perfecting his methods. And soon he would take the next step. By 1979, California was drowning in fear. The East Area Rapist had attacked more than 50 women. He had stalked neighborhoods, taunted police, and shattered the lives of countless families. But what no one could imagine was that he was preparing for an even darker evolution. It started with couples. In Santa Barbara County, a young pair was found murdered in their home. At first, police thought it was an isolated case, but then in Goleta, Ventura, and Orange County, the killings continued. A horrifying pattern was taking shape. The man who had been content to dominate and humiliate his victims was now taking lives. The new crimes bore the same eerie trademarks: break-ins at night, bindings, and the cruel stacking of dishes. But now there were gunshots, bludgeonings, and bodies left behind. Detectives realized with sickening clarity that the East Area Rapist had transformed into something new, a killer with no limits. The press began calling him the original Night Stalker, a name that captured the chilling reality of a predator who hunted in the dark, slipped past locked doors, and left death in his wake. The murder victims ranged from young couples in their 20s to families living in quiet suburbs. The brutality shocked even seasoned detectives. In one case, a husband and wife were found bound and executed in their bedroom. Their children slept in the next room, unharmed but forever scarred. In another, a couple was bludgeoned to death after being tied up, their home ransacked for hours before the killer disappeared. What made the crimes even more terrifying was how ordinary the victims were. They weren't involved in crime. They weren't living in dangerous neighborhoods. They were teachers, professionals, young parents. The randomness made everyone a potential target. Forensic evidence confirmed what investigators feared. The same man who had terrorized Northern California as the East Area Rapist was now murdering in Southern California. He had migrated down the state like a storm, leaving destruction in his path. The investigation became one of the largest in California history. Task forces were formed across multiple counties. Detectives worked together, pooling resources, sharing notes, and following every lead. But the killer remained invisible. He wore gloves, left almost no physical evidence, and seemed to have an uncanny awareness of police activity. Some investigators suspected he had law enforcement training, or even that he might be an officer himself. His ability to control crime scenes, to anticipate moves, and to vanish without a trace was unlike anything they had seen. Victims' families lived in agony. One woman whose sister had been killed described sitting in her car outside her house every night with a shotgun across her lap. "I didn't sleep for years," she later said. "I was waiting for him to come back." The murders continued until 1986, when suddenly, inexplicably, they stopped. California exhaled in relief, but the fear lingered. Everyone wondered, had he been arrested for another crime? Had he moved out of state? Or was he simply waiting for the right moment to return? For more than 3 decades, the original Night Stalker vanished from headlines. New generations grew up not knowing his name, while survivors and detectives carried the weight of unfinished business. The attacks faded into urban legend. Some referred to him as a ghost, others as a nightmare that belonged to the past. But those who had lived through the terror never forgot. Detectives who had worked the case retired, but many never stopped thinking about him. One investigator admitted that he kept a box of case files in his garage, reopening them on sleepless nights. "I couldn't let go," he said. I promised the families we would find him. Meanwhile, advances in DNA technology were beginning to change the landscape of criminal investigations. The biological evidence collected at crime scenes decades earlier was still preserved in storage. What had once been useless was now a key waiting to be turned. The Golden State Killer left behind more than physical victims. He left behind communities transformed by fear. In the Sacramento suburbs, people who lived through the 1970s described how entire neighborhoods changed overnight. Sleepovers for kids stopped. Families refused to leave windows open. The illusion of safety in suburbia was shattered forever. Survivors carried scars that never healed. Some spoke of nightmares that returned every year on the anniversary of their attacks. Others described marriages broken by trauma and trust issues that lingered long after the assaults. One survivor said, "He didn't just steal a night of my life. He stole decades. He stole the way I looked at the world." The crimes also left a mark on law enforcement. The case became a haunting reminder of limits. Entire careers were defined by the pursuit of a man they could not catch. For the families of the murdered, the silence was unbearable. They had no answers, no closure, only the hollow question: who was he? And then, in the 2000s, whispers began again. A new wave of detectives armed with new technology started reopening the files. The killer had gone silent, but his DNA had not. The greatest breakthrough in the case was just around the corner. By the early 2000s, forensic science had undergone a revolution. What detectives in the 1970s could only dream of was now possible. Tiny traces of biological material could unlock identities with absolute certainty. The Golden State Killer had left behind DNA at multiple crime scenes, samples carefully collected and preserved in evidence lockers for decades. At first, investigators compared the samples against known offenders in criminal databases like CODIS, but no match came. That might have been the end of it, but investigators refused to give up. They turned to something new, something experimental: genetic genealogy. Instead of relying only on criminal databases, they uploaded the killer's DNA profile to public genealogy websites, where ordinary people searched for their ancestors. And there, a door finally opened. When the DNA was uploaded, distant relatives of the unknown suspect appeared in the results. They weren't close family, no brothers or children, but third and fourth cousins. Still, it was enough. Investigators began constructing family trees, tracing branches backward through generations and then forward again, identifying potential suspects who could fit the profile. It was painstaking work, requiring thousands of hours of cross-referencing, birth records, marriage certificates, and addresses. But slowly, the picture narrowed. Among the family trees, one man stood out, a former police officer, a man who had lived in the very neighborhoods where the attacks began, a man whose history aligned eerily with the timeline of crimes. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. To his neighbors, DeAngelo was an aging, cranky man living quietly in a Sacramento suburb. He complained about lawn clippings, shouted at passers-by, and seemed perpetually angry. But nothing about him suggested he had once been the most wanted predator in California. DeAngelo had worked as a police officer in the 1970s, giving him the training and insider knowledge that explained how he had evaded capture for so long. He had married, raised children, and later become a grandfather. To outsiders, he was just another retiree with a bad temper. But to detectives studying the evidence, every detail of his life lined up. His police background explained his tactical precision. His residence matched the geographic spread of the crimes. His age placed him in the right range during the 1970s and 1980s. Now, all that was needed was proof. Police began surveillance on DeAngelo. They followed him, watched his habits, and collected items he discarded: tissues, pieces of trash, anything that might contain his DNA. When the samples were tested against the preserved evidence from the 1970s crimes, the results were undeniable. It was a perfect match. After more than 40 years, the faceless phantom of California had a name. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker. They were all one man, Joseph James DeAngelo. In April 2018, detectives moved in. DeAngelo was arrested outside his home in Citrus Heights, California. For the first time in history, the Golden State Killer was confronted with justice. The news spread like wildfire. For survivors who had lived in fear for decades, it was both shocking and cathartic. Some cried, some screamed. Others simply sat in stunned silence. The monster who had haunted their lives was not a ghost, after all. He was an old man, their neighbor, the man they passed in the grocery store. One survivor said, "I thought he was dead. I thought he had disappeared into the earth. To see his face, to hear his name, it broke me all over again. But it also set me free." The headlines were everywhere. Golden State Killer arrested after 40 years. California's longest nightmare had finally ended. When Joseph James DeAngelo was brought into court for the first time in 2018, the image shocked the world. For decades, survivors had pictured a towering monster. Instead, they saw a frail old man in an orange prison jumpsuit, slumped in a wheelchair, eyes downcast, his body failing. But appearances meant nothing. Behind that weak exterior was the man who had bound and terrorized families, who had whispered threats in the dark, who had left entire neighborhoods trembling. Survivors knew that evil did not vanish with age. As the charges were read, they filled the courtroom. 13 counts of murder, 13 counts of kidnapping, and dozens of uncharged rapes. Though many of his sexual assaults could no longer be prosecuted due to statutes of limitations, prosecutors ensured that his murders alone would be enough to keep him behind bars forever. The most powerful moments came not from the prosecution, but from the survivors themselves. One by one, men and women who had been young in the 1970s stood up in court and spoke directly to DeAngelo. "I was just 15 when you came into my house," one woman said, her voice shaking. "For years, I thought you would come back. Every creak of the floor, every phone call at night, I thought it was you. You took my childhood. But today, I take my life back." Another survivor described the lifelong trauma of living with the memory of his crimes. "You bound me, you mocked me, you told me I was nothing. But look at me now. I am still here. I survived. And you will die in prison." Family members of murder victims also spoke. Some wept as they described decades of grief. Others stared at DeAngelo with quiet fury. One father, whose daughter had been killed, leaned forward and said, "You thought you would never be caught. But here you are. Old, weak, powerless. You are nothing." DeAngelo himself said almost nothing. When he did speak, his words were barely audible. He offered a whispered apology, but for many, it rang hollow. In June 2020, DeAngelo entered a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to all charges, 13 murders and 13 kidnappings, in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He also admitted to dozens of rapes that could no longer be charged. The plea ensured that families would not have to endure a long and grueling trial. It also guaranteed that DeAngelo would spend the rest of his life in prison without parole. The judge in sentencing said, "You will never again walk free. You will spend every remaining day of your life in a cell, haunted by the voices of those you terrorized." And with that, after more than 40 years, justice was finally delivered. The arrest and conviction of the Golden State Killer marked a turning point not only for his victims, but for criminal investigations everywhere. His capture demonstrated the power of DNA and genetic genealogy, ushering in a new era of solving cold cases. Dozens of other long unsolved murders across the United States were revisited using the same methods. Serial killers once thought untouchable were finally identified. Families who had waited decades for answers began to find closure. For survivors of the Golden State Killer, Justice brought relief, but it did not erase the scars. Many continued to live with fear, nightmares, and broken trust. But they also found strength in one another. Support groups formed, friendships developed, and voices once silenced by shame became powerful advocates for victims of crime. One survivor put it best. He thought he broke us. But we are stronger than he will ever be. He is the one who ended up broken. The Golden State Killer's story is more than a tale of crime. It is a lesson in patience, persistence, and the endurance of survivors. It shows how evil can hide in plain sight behind the mask of an ordinary man, and how justice, though delayed, can still be achieved. Joseph James DeAngelo lived for decades as a husband, father, grandfather, and neighbor. He shopped in local stores, drove through the same neighborhoods he once terrorized, and lived quietly while his victims carried the weight of his crimes. His story proves that monsters do not live only in shadows. They can live next door. And yet, the story also proves that the shadows can be chased away, that science, perseverance, and the determination of victims and investigators can unmask even the most elusive predator. DeAngelo will die in prison. His legacy is not one of triumph, but of exposure. His crimes will never be forgotten, but neither will the strength of those who faced him. One of the most important figures in the renewed hunt for the Golden State Killer wasn't a detective at all. It was Michelle McNamara, a true crime writer who coined the name Golden State Killer in her groundbreaking investigation. Through her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, she re-energized public interest in the case. She meticulously researched police files, interviewed survivors, and pieced together a narrative that reignited momentum among investigators. Though Michelle tragically passed away in 2016, her work directly contributed to keeping the case alive in the public eye. When DeAngelo was arrested in 2018, many credited her persistence as part of the reason the case remained active long enough for DNA technology to finally solve it. Her story reminds us that sometimes the pursuit of justice comes not only from police, but from ordinary people unwilling to let the truth die. The capture of Joseph DeAngelo marked a watershed moment in forensic history. The use of genetic genealogy, building family trees from DNA databases, proved that even the coldest cases could be cracked. Within months of his arrest, other cases across the United States began to fall. The decades-old mystery of the Bear Brook murders in New Hampshire, the identification of the infamous NorCal rapist, and countless other cold cases were solved using the same method. But this breakthrough also raised ethical debates. Should police have access to genealogy websites used by families for ancestry research? Where should the line be drawn between privacy and justice? These questions remain, but for the families of victims, the answers were clear. The truth was worth finding, no matter how long it took. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror forever changed California. Neighborhoods that once felt idyllic learned how fragile safety could be. Families altered their lives permanently, installing locks, alarms, and routines that persisted long after the danger was gone. But out of the darkness also came resilience. Survivors who once felt isolated found each other, shared their stories, and stood together. Communities that were broken by fear eventually rebuilt, stronger and more vigilant. In court, survivor after survivor spoke not only of pain, but of endurance. They were living proof that even in the face of unimaginable terror, the human spirit survives. Perhaps the most chilling lesson of all is how ordinary Joseph DeAngelo appeared. He was not a shadowy stranger hiding in the woods, but a man living in the suburbs, a former police officer, a father and grandfather. He mowed his lawn, went shopping, and waved at neighbors. Evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the man next door. That reality unsettled many, but it also reminded communities to trust instincts, to stay vigilant, and to remember that appearances can be deceiving. In 2020, when DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without parole, survivors and families finally felt a measure of peace. He could no longer hurt anyone. His name was no longer an anonymous terror. It was exposed for all to see. Some describe feeling relief, others emptiness. Justice, even when delivered, does not erase scars, but closure, however imperfect, is powerful. For the families of murder victims, the knowledge that DeAngelo would die behind bars offered the first true comfort in decades. For survivors of his assaults, the chance to face him in court and tell their stories was a reclamation of power. The story of the Golden State Killer is one of horror, but also one of justice. It is about a predator who believed he could outrun time, only to be caught by the persistence of victims, investigators, and science itself. It is a story that spans generations. Children who grew up in fear, detectives who refused to quit, families who demanded answers, and a society that refused to forget. And in the end, it is a story of light breaking through darkness. Joseph James DeAngelo will spend the rest of his life in a cell. He is no longer the faceless phantom, the whisper in the dark, the intruder with a mask and a flashlight. He is a prisoner, stripped of power, remembered not for the life he built, but for the terror he inflicted. The survivors remain. They live with scars, but also with strength. Their voices, once silenced by fear, now echo louder than his ever will. And so the lesson is clear. Evil can hide, but it cannot escape forever. Shadows stretch long, but in the end, justice finds a way.